Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into something fascinating. We're tracking a journey that starts in the incredibly high pressure, totally exhausting tech scene in New York, and it's going to take us all the way back through ancient philosophy and theology. We are unpacking what's called the logos of the ripple effect. The big question we want to answer here is, how do our internal, seemingly invisible, everyday choices actually end up shaping the physical world? Let's trace this path, right from modern cynicism straight to a radical new way to look at freedom, form, and communion.
So, our source author actually started out in the startup world. Picture being surrounded by absolutely brilliant people, but they're all operating purely on game theory and market incentives. In that kind of environment, you hear this idea all the time. There's literally no such thing as the right thing, there's only what's effective. And, when you're looking at reality just through the lens of leverage and market capture, well, practical compromise and a heavy dose of calculated cynicism kind of feel like your only rational options. It's not that this mindset is intentionally evil. It honestly makes perfect sense if you truly believe the world is nothing more than a broken system of competing powers.
But here's the thing, that cynical worldview, it eventually leads to absolute crushing burnout. The author found themselves feeling super isolated and exhausted, and actually ended up turning to existentialist thinkers, specifically Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, Sartre forces this really uncomfortable realization on us. Even if you're in a completely broken system, you aren't just a victim of circumstance, you are still making choices. So, riding the subway before dawn, confronting the stark reality of their own agency, the author hit this unavoidable question. What is freedom actually for? I mean, if we aren't just gears in a machine, what exactly are we supposed to be aiming at? To get to the bottom of that, we have to look at how we view reality itself. The default modern setting is basically materialism. In this view, reality is just stuff. It's matter, it's neurons, markets, power dynamics, which makes goodness nothing more than a useful little fiction we project onto the world. But phenomenology totally flips this on its head. It argues that, hey, we don't even have direct access to raw matter. Literally everything we know about the world filters through our conscious experience. So what if we suspend all those materialistic assumptions and just start with human consciousness as our baseline? Funny enough, starting with consciousness leads us straight back to the ancient thinkers, specifically Plato. Plato realized something absolutely wild about the human mind. Think about a perfect circle. You instantly recognize the concept of it, right? Even though every single physical drawing of a circle in the real world is technically flawed. We didn't invent that perfection, we discovered it. And if our minds can somehow recognize this pre-existing objective mathematical order, well, maybe we're doing the exact same thing when we recognize a higher objective moral order, when we genuinely reach for things like justice or goodness. Aristotle totally bought into this. He believed that politics shouldn't just be about basic survival. It should actively cultivate this good. But fast forward to the 20th century. Society was terrified by how often really dangerous ideologies were masked as the ultimate good. So we made what the source calls the modern bargain. We essentially just stopped speaking seriously about the good altogether. Instead, we retreated to the lowest common denominators, money and efficiency. We swapped out virtue for efficiency because it just feels safer, which unfortunately ends up making total indifference look like a respectable life choice. But here's the reality check. Retreating from the good doesn't actually make us safe. It just makes us cynical. Looking for an antidote to this, the source found some amazing inspiration in Confucius. Now, Confucius lived through a time of massive technological and political upheaval, which sounds pretty familiar, right? He saw that simply writing better rules or building more efficient courts just wasn't enough to hold a society together. True harmony requires cultivating trust. And trust, that comes from forming the human will through virtue and ritual. Those tiny, everyday acts of respect and etiquette aren't just empty formalities. They are literally the training ground for the soul. And this brings us to the absolute core mystery of this explainer. If small acts of virtue can reshape the social world, how does that actually work? How does your private, quiet choice to be a good person transform into an outward historical reality? Can virtue really scale up to change an entire system? Or is it just going to get completely crushed by the guy in the corner office playing that cynical game of power? To bridge this massive gap between the interior and the exterior, the source turns to philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He says reality has an outside and an inside. The without is the measurable physical exterior. It's bodies, structures, the stuff you can touch. The within is our interiority, our consciousness, our freedom, our desires. In that cynical startup world we talked about, the within is just a strategy you use to dominate the without. But Teilhard argues, no, these aren't two separate stories.
Our inner free will inherently wants to embody itself in external history. The whole tension of being human is how our inner consciousness is constantly seeking to become physical form. Right here, the source material takes a super fascinating turn into early Christian theology, looking at Athanasius. The ultimate answer to how the within becomes the without is found in this radical concept of the incarnation. This idea that the Word became flesh means that the deepest possible interiority entered the physical world, but it didn't do it through some strategic domination or market leverage or conquering armies. It entered through a fragile human body, through total humility and self-giving love. It completely flips the script, suggesting the physical world isn't some prison we're stuck in, it's the exact vessel for redemption. Building on that thought, Maximus the Confessor proposed that the material world isn't just dead matter. Every single created thing has a logos, an inner meaning or purpose. Because of this, every form carries a hidden invitation. The entire material world is a classroom. Let's make this practical. Sending a quick, passive-aggressive email isn't just some neutral data transfer. It is a physical action that literally shapes a system, while at the exact same time, it's educating your own patience or maybe your pride. Every single action shapes the external world and forms who you are internally. So, how does all this ancient theology actually map onto our modern world? Beautifully, it turns out. We can see it through modern complexity theory. Think of a massive flock of birds moving together, or a bustling global economy. There is no central boss giving orders from the top. The global pattern emerges entirely from millions of tiny, local, individual interactions. This perfectly explains the mechanics of the ripple effect. It shows us, mathematically, how small, local acts of virtue, or vice for that matter, can cascade through feedback loops and fundamentally alter a completely global environment. The exact mechanics of how this scales up actually follow a really clear progression. It all starts with just one internal habit. Over time, that habit solidifies into your character. When enough people start to share that character, it scales up into a culture. And ultimately, that culture builds the massive institutions that will train the next generation of souls. This is exactly why a cynical choice is never just a private mistake. It is a pattern generator. It literally lowers the cost of betrayal for everyone else in the entire system. Let's look at a concept from complexity theory called an attractor basin. Imagine a massive valley that water just naturally flows down into, completely regardless of where a raindrop starts on the mountain. When it comes to our moral choices, this means the sheer size or magnitude of your action actually matters way less than its fundamental alignment with the system's core pattern, the attractor. A massive world-changing action that is fundamentally misaligned is eventually just going to dissipate into chaos. But a tiny, totally hidden act of mercy that is actually aligned with the true logos, that gets taken up into the deep, permanent order of reality, which forces us to ask a pretty tough question. What are you aligned with? If the direction of your contribution matters more than its size, we really have to audit our daily actions. Think about the chaotic basin of the modern world we live in. Are your seemingly insignificant choices aligned with fear, with status, with a desire to dominate others? Or are they aligned with a higher ordered love? Because whatever you choose to align with, that is exactly the pattern you are helping to generate for the rest of the world. To truly wrap our heads around this flow, the source examines the architecture of the philosopher Bonaventure, focusing specifically on two concepts, exitus and redditus. Exodus is the outward flow, its creation moving out into multiplicity, different, and real, actual agency. You have true freedom, which is amazing. But freedom without a goal, that just becomes chaotic fragmentation. And that's where redditus, the return, comes in. This isn't about crushing your freedom, it's about that free agency willingly gathering itself back together as a meaningful, ordered love. And this right here reveals the solution to our modern dilemma. The world is definitely not going to be saved by some cynical, top-down control system that just tries to eliminate human freedom. We know that doesn't work. That's just the old game theory trap all over again. True systemic salvation happens when freedom aligns itself with a unifying center. Freedom only becomes fruitful, meaning it creates beautiful, complex harmony instead of a chaotic collapse, when it freely chooses to return to the good. Moving along to philosopher Henry de Lubac, we see how this reconciliation of the interior and the exterior actually becomes a real social reality. Because it can't just be a neat intellectual exercise in your head. An interior act of the will has to become a visible action. That action forms a habit. Shared habits build a community, and ultimately that community ascends into true communion. The internal realization literally has to become a visible, living, breathing body of people. At the very end of this profound philosophical journey, the source finds the ultimate expression of this entire framework in the Catholic concept of the Eucharist. The final, perfect social order isn't some perfectly balanced market equilibrium, and it certainly isn't game theory survival. It is scattered, wildly different individual human wills being drawn together into a unified communion. They are all ordered around a single center of love, but, and this is key, without erasing the things that make them uniquely different. So, as we wrap things up today, let's look at the redeemed ripple effect. The continuous loop you should really take away from this explainer is incredibly profound. Your internal will inherently seeks a physical form. That form directly shapes the physical world around you. And then those worldly consequences bounce right back to educate and form your own soul. It is a constant, unbroken, ongoing participation in the very structure of reality itself. We started today looking at the heavy cynicism of people who believe that only the brutal, effective rules of the game matter. But as we've seen, reality is actually driven by the alignment of our inner will. So if your inner freedom literally dictates the outward form of the world, what world are your absolute smallest, quietest choices building today? Are you feeding the chaos, or are you returning your freedom to a higher, ordered love? Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring these ideas on your own. Catch you next time!